Okay, great. So, lovely to see you all. Um, yeah, welcome back. Welcome to Lecture 10. So, the aim for today is going to be to talk about, well, the lecture is called Possible Worlds, but there's really two parts to what I want to talk about today. The first is about modal logic, effectively. And this is a kind of extension of both TFL and FOL. Primarily FOL, but we'll talk about it in both terms, that's designed specifically to capture the notions of possibility and necessity. So what I want to do at the beginning here is to talk about the general notion of modality, talk about different senses of modality. This will then let us segue into thinking about modal logic. And importantly, the way that we actually do modal logic requires, in some sense of requires, thinking about possible worlds. So that's the first kind of half, thinking about modality and then getting us to thinking about how we might formally approach this idea. Then the second half is trying to cash out the notion of what possible worlds are. And here what we're going to try and do is look at two different metaphysical accounts of what worlds are. So we have Lewis's modal realism and a form of linguistic ersatism. So more on what exactly the hell those are in the interregnum. So yeah, that's basically the plan. I want to try and get through the first part, really get us kind of going, motivate the reasons why we'd be interested in possible worlds, and then think about what they are. That's the plan. Sounds good? Cool. You know the drill by now. We're 10 weeks in. You know how this goes. Stop me if you have questions. So let's start off by thinking about modality, this general idea. So modal claims are claims not about, or not merely about, what is the case or isn't the case, but instead about what must or could be. So there's a way to kind of get into this by thinking about, so we have, my sweater is red. Okay, this is true. And as well as being true, it's possibly true. That is, it could be true. But similarly, it seems possible that my sweater could be gray. For example, I go home, I throw it in the wash with a whole load of bleach on accident, and then it bleaches out a lot of the color, so instead of being this sort of red color, it turns into this weird muddy gray. That seems possible. So the second sentence is not in fact true, but it's possibly true. It could be true. Another one, we think about my sweater is a sweater. Well, again, certainly true. And it has a ring of possibly being something that must be the case. If this thing is going to be anything at all, then it needs to be a sweater. And again, we could kind of debate this. We might think, oh, maybe actually this thing could exist as like a rag, right? Or I could cut the sleeves off and then it's turned into like a really hideous vest, right? Or I could turn it into a skirt, though I'm not going to do that, right? Again, note in all of these cases, what we're thinking about isn't what is the case, but what's possible. And then finally, we have claims like, my sweater is a flying nuclear-powered wombat, right? Silly, obviously false, and plausibly not just false, but like it couldn't be the case. This thing could be a dress, it could be a rag, it could be a vest, but it just seems beyond the pale to think that this very thing could be a weird nuclear-powered wombat. So again, if you get the idea here, we're already kind of going. The thought is that when we're interested in modal claims, we're after not just what is or isn't true, but we're after what could be true, what could be false, what must be the case. And modal claims are just, they crop up everywhere in philosophy. Here's a slightly silly one that you might have already come across. There's the idea that ought implies can. Right? If you should do it, then it's possible to do it. Similarly, if you think about like Cartesian skepticism or Cartesian dualism, relies upon the idea that the mind could exist separate from the body. That could isn't that it does, but that there's a possible situation where you've got one and not the other. And again, insert other claims here. A lot of these will often deal with showing that things are distinct. You could have one and not the other, hence they must not be the same object or the same kind of thing. Okay. So modal claims, interesting. What's really striking, though, is that our FOL system and our TFL system cannot capture them. Because all of our logic that we've talked about so far just deals with things that are or are not true. We don't have any tools to talk about when things could be true or must be true. So, modal claims concern what we might think of as modes of truth. This is actually where the notion comes from. Right? And there's a bunch of different modes. So one of them would be being possibly true. This is a claim that could be true. Right? So my sweater's red, my sweater's gray. It seems like plausibly these could be true. But of course, being possibly true doesn't mean that you're possibly false. Take anything that must be the case. Well, if it must be the case, then it certainly could be the case. In fact, this is the idea underlying ought implies can. But if you must do it, then you should be able to do it.
What's the difference between possibly true and contingent?
Good. So notably, for contingent, it's possibly true and possibly false.
So every necessary truth is also possibly true?
But it's not contingent because it's locked into being true. That's the idea, right? So again, we can kind of think of these as different modes of truth in a very loose way. Please.
How is it not able to be false?
Good. So again, if we're thinking about a necessary truth, remember way back at the very beginning, these are sentences or claims that aren't just true, but it's not possible to make them false. It's very hard to think of examples. Because, well, and this was something we talked about way back in that very first tutorial, but there's certainly going to be some sentences, maybe by their structure, that must be true. Here's a very silly one. Doesn't really matter what sentence P is, but this TFL sentence is a necessary truth. It's a tautology. There's no way for it to be false. Why? Because of its logical structure. But that's not really an interesting one. Interesting one are claims like, my sweater is a sweater, if it exists. 2 + 2 is 4. That seems, if it's true, it's not just contingent or possibly true, it has to be the case. Again, we might debate about this. So again, we have possibly true, so it could be true. There's a possible situation in which it's true. Necessarily true, which is it could be true and it could not be false. Contingent is could be true or could be false. And of course, right, we could flip these. These could also be possibly false, necessarily false. Yes?
Sorry, I don't understand how something can be possibly true but not contingent.
Good. So the idea is the possibly true includes all the contingencies and the necessary truths. Because in order to be possibly true, there just needs to be at least one situation where the claim is true. And if it's necessarily true, well, there's not just one, but every situation is where it's true. So think about it this way, right? To be possibly true, you can switch it on. There's at least one way to switch the sentence on. If it's forced on, if it's locked into the on position, but no matter what you do, it will always be in the on position. It's possibly true because in every situation, it is true.
Oh, your sweater is required to have a collar.
If it exists, right?
Yeah.
That'd be something that looks possibly true because it's not just possibly, but it must be so. That's the kind of idea, right? So again, merely possibly true is very broad. It includes the contingencies and the ones that have to be so. Just like how we might think of possibly false as the ones that must be false and that could be switched on and off.
Those are my questions.
Yeah, basically it's the same idea, right? Again, these could be swapped with the other truth value, right? One thing to note is we do have a specific term for the necessary false, and this is impossible. Something's impossible if there's no way to make it true. So again, this is the kind of broad idea about modes of truth. Possibly true, possibly false, necessarily true, necessarily false, etc., etc., etc. Now, one thing that's lurking in the background here is that there's not a single sense of possibility and necessity. Right? Yes?
So, contingency is just it could be true.
Could be true and could be false.
But it's without the necessaries. So it's possibly true, because possibly true is includes contingencies and the necessary true, and then you have the possibly false, and then you have so the contingencies are just the possibly truths, which are the same as possibly false, without the necessary false with the necessary true.
Bingo.
Okay.
Yep. Basically, the contingencies of the big block, there's going to be, most claims are probably going to be contingent. It seems feasible that they could be true and they could be false. Now, as I said, there's different senses of possibility and necessity. Or to put it another way, there's different senses of modality. Right? One very important difference here is the difference between what we might think of as alethic modalities versus non-alethic. So, what does alethic mean? It means having to do with truth. Okay? So alethic modalities will be ones that are concerned with the way the world could or could not be. So for example, when we were thinking about logical truth, logical possibility, right? When we were doing things like valuations, this was about an alethic possibility. Contrast this with what we might think of as epistemic possibility. Epistemic possibility is, for all I know, P could be the case. Epistemic possibility is not constrained by truth, because we could just be wrong. For all I know, water isn't H2O. Cool, that's wrong. So again, our first division is between alethic, which is ones that are aimed about what could be or not be the case, versus non-alethic, which might be, say, again, epistemic, having to do with what someone knows or takes to be true. Now, when we think about alethic possibilities and necessities, or alethic modalities, we can build a kind of hierarchy. And the hierarchy we can describe in two different ways. Right? It depends on which notion we're thinking of as primary. If we think about possibility as primary, we can think about going from the broadest sense of possibility to the narrowest. What I mean by this, right? So let's go through some examples. So we might have a notion of logical possibility. This is literally, hey, does taking this to be true lead to a contradiction? Then you have metaphysical possibility. This is something that seems possible given what we take to be the laws of metaphysics, or something along these lines. Then we have nomological or physical possibility. What's permissible or compatible with the laws of physics? And then finally, real possibility. This is basically, what could I literally do in the very mundane, normal sense of could? So it's really possible for me to pick up the cup. It's nomologically possible for the cup to quantum tunnel off to the other side of the Earth. It's not really possible. It's not very feasible. But it could happen according to the laws of physics. Similarly, it's maybe metaphysically possible, right, that there is no cup at all. It's just some simple parts arranged cup-wise. And then finally, it's logically possible, right? Well, let's just say it's logically possible for anything that doesn't lead to a contradiction. This cup could go faster than the speed of light. This cup could start talking to me and telling me how much it hates me drinking out of it. All of this is logically possible. And the reason we think about this going from the broadest to the narrowest sense of possibility is there are more things possible logically than there are possible really. Please.
What was meant with nomologically and really?
Good. So nomologically means compatible with the laws of nature. So this just is another way to say physical possibility. Real, it's hard to cash out this notion, but this is basically what could we with our regular abilities do. So again, a characteristic real possibility is it's really possible for me to pick up the cup. It's not really possible for the cup to quantum tunnel to the other side of the Earth, but it's certainly nomologically possible.
Goes with the alephic, and which is the difference between alephic and non.
Good. So alethic possibility is again aimed at what is concerned with truth. So in all of these cases, we're always concerned with, in some sense, how the world could go. And non-alethic ones, again, we can take the epistemic sense as primary here, don't really concern with how the world could shake out, but with how things fit with, say, the way that I think, or what I believe, or what I take to be true. So alethic modalities are constrained by, in some sense, the world. Non-alethic ones are not.
And is it that the broader the options, the stronger the arguments?
So stronger the sense of possibility.
Oh, that's good.
So again, we can kind of think about this, right? Is it possible for this cup to move faster than the speed of light? Certainly not really possible. It's not very likely, given all of our usual capacities. It's not nomologically possible, at least according to the way we think of the laws of nature, right? It would violate the laws of nature for anything to go faster than the speed of light. Is it metaphysically possible? Sure. Because the laws of nature could have been different. It seems metaphysically possible. Is it logically possible? Absolutely. Because there's no inherent contradiction in this thing going faster than the speed of light.
So it has nothing to do with classification.
So all of this is kind of independent of how we might come to know what the possibilities are, anything like this. We're just thinking about the grades of this modal strength. And the way we can, again, think about it, if we're thinking about possibilities, logical possibility gives us the biggest range of options. It has the biggest logical space, the space of possibilities. And then metaphysical possibility will pick us out like, okay, we're going to take this bit where, let's say whenever you have a bunch of simples, you always get some complex object coming out of it. Or let's say if you have something that started off as an organic entity, it must be organic for its whole duration. Again, these are the kind of thoughts here, right? The laws of metaphysics, however those actually cash out. We're not too concerned with what they actually are. Then you have nomological, which is like, okay, cool. Here are the laws of nature. This will constrain the metaphysical possibilities. Metaphysically possible for this to go faster than the speed of light, not nomological. The laws of nature are such that it doesn't allow for that fast of a speed if you have mass. And then finally you have the smallest one even further, which is like, okay, given the way the actual facts are, what's very likely? It's really possible for my sweater to become gray. Because again, it'd be easy. I could spill a shitload of bleach on it and then cool, it's done. It's metaphysically possible for it to become gray right now. Just snap and it's gray. Right? There's nothing metaphysically that would prevent that. There might be physical reasons why that couldn't happen. There might be real reasons. So again, if we're thinking about this in terms of possibility, the broadest possibilities are the ones that give us the most of those. Yes?
Why is logic above metaphysics?
Good. So this is debatable. But importantly, one way to cash this idea out is the logical possibility is just doesn't lead to a contradiction. Now you might think that there are some things that are not metaphysically possible, that are logically possible. Here's a stupid example, but it's a nice one. It seems logically possible, at least purely in terms of not generating a contradiction, that something is red all over and green all over at the same time in the same respect.
And that's logically possible?
That's logically possible. But of course we know the way that colors work, that's not metaphysically possible. So this is an example. Probably the most famous one, the color exclusion problem. Right? So that is, right, if you have something that's got, it's all red all over, then there's obviously some sense in which this thing couldn't be green all over at the same time in the same respect. But purely from a logical perspective, there's no problem here, because that's just to say this sentence could be true.
Yes.
Logically, it's possible.
It's red and green.
All over at the same time.
Isn't it contradictory?
That's the problem. It's only contradictory if we interpret the predicates in a certain kind of way. If we take color exclusion to be a law. But there's nothing in the actual logic of the situation, just from our purely formal approach, that requires something couldn't be red all over and green all over at the same time.
Then how is it physically impossible?
So what we assume, Jesus, what we assume is a kind of metaphysical law that things can only be one color all over at one time. So this is again the kind of thought here. Effectively, when we go from that super wide, we start narrowing the range of possibilities we take. And here's how we do it. We hold certain facts as necessary.
And you can make an interpretation of that in a way that doesn't come to a contradiction.
We can make this true, right? Which means that this is not a contradiction. We can build an interpretation that makes it true. It's easy, right? Let's have the domain be A. Let's have A be the extension of R and the extension of G. Cool, this sentence is not a contradiction. From the logic perspective, no problem. The metaphysical perspective, you're like, what? So, here's the idea. Again, we can think of this range of possibilities as just a bunch of sentences. And the sentences could be true, they could be false. If they're possibly false, they're in the sphere of possibility. The broadest sense of possibility is the one that has the most things that could be true. On the flip side, when we think about necessity, effectively our hierarchy inverts. Logical necessity is the strongest. What that really means is that it has the fewest necessities. Because there are actually very few things that turn out to be necessarily true from a purely logical perspective. Because they're only going to be necessarily true in virtue of their logical form. But then, of course, right, if we think about metaphysical necessities, there's going to be more. Here's a plausible one. Nothing can be multiple colors all over at the same time in the same respect. But again, there's nothing in the logic of the situation that requires this. It's something about the way that we think colors work, what we think they are. So we start adding more necessities, which restricts the space of possibilities. Please.
What then would be the difference between real possibility and metaphysical possibility?
Good. So what we're thinking of with metaphysical possibilities / metaphysical necessity is something like whatever's compatible with these metaphysical laws. Real possibility / necessity is, in a very mundane sense, what could we easily and naturally do?
Empirical.
It's nomologically possible for me to run a 4-minute mile. Right? It's certainly not really possible for me to do that. Jesus Christ, no. Right? That's the difference here. Real possibility is, look, given the way things are, what's feasible? Nomological is what's just simply compatible with the laws of nature. Metaphysical is what's compatible with metaphysical laws, which is broader because we can change the laws of nature.
For what cases would it be possible for me to topple this over and float to the top?
And so that this would be certainly metaphysically possible, it's logically possible, depending on how we understand the case, maybe even nomologically possible, depending on how we think like gravitation works. So, I mean, but again, it's certainly not really possible. That's the way we can kind of go. So again, what we have is effectively, again, a narrowing or widening. If we're thinking about the space of what could be the case, right? The very top has the most possibles. The very bottom has the fewest possibles, the narrowest range. That's because the very top has the fewest necessities, things that have to be so, whereas the very bottom one has the most things that must be so. Please.
Can things change from like, at first they're only metaphysical possible, but because of science they become nomological possible?
Good. So what we could learn is that actually something is both, right? So here's the kind of nice thing, right? Oh, it turns out that we thought this wasn't nomologically possible, but that was because we were wrong about what the laws of nature were. But no, that doesn't mean that it wasn't in fact nomologically possible. We were just wrong about what possibilities were in there.
So it was all the time nomological, but we didn't knew it yet.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Right? This is again the difference between an alethic one and a non-alethic one. We're not settling this question. We're learning it, but we're not settling it.
And what about, like, I can't lift 100 Ks right now, but I could train to lift it?
You could get there, right?
Yeah.
Right? Again, this would be one that's nomologically, but not really. Okay. Please.
Real necessity doesn't imply a logical necessity.
No. So here's the cool thing, right? When we think about the strongest to weakest, the stronger necessities hold further down, but not vice versa. So everything that's logically necessary is also going to be really, and all the ones in between, but not the other way around. Again, here's a real necessity. It's a real necessity that Nathan can't run a 4-minute mile. Right? But it's certainly logically possible. Right? This is the other cool thing. So when we think about strong necessity to weaker ones, there's an entailment. If you're necessary in a stronger sense, you're also necessary in the weaker one. Similarly, if you're possible in a narrow sense, you're going to be possible in the broader sense, but not vice versa. Again, let's take, it's a logical necessity that for every sentence it's either true or false. Well, cool, then it's a real necessity that every sentence is either true or false. it's a real possibility that Nathan goes and picks up his cup. Well, then it's definitely a logical possibility that Nathan goes and picks up his cup. It's a logical possibility that this cup, right, is both a cup and a wombat. That's certainly not a real possibility. It's logically, you see the plan, right? Again, and basically all of this is just two different ways to carve up this space. Necessities, we're thinking about what must be true, and of course, as we narrow the range of possibilities, we're holding more and more and more things fixed.
So all the possibilities are contained in the necessity.
Yeah. So the key thing here is that the necessities, right, the things that must be true, the possibilities, well, that's the stuff that could be switched on and off. Again, different senses. This is the important thing for us. We have different senses of possibility. And what we're going to talk about, modal logic, allows for us to capture these different senses. So let's talk about how we formally capture these ideas. So modal logic, as a form of basically what we were doing in the first half of this course, is a logical system concerned with understanding the deductive behavior of modal claims. That's just a fancy way of saying it's a formal system to make sense of some claims about possibility and necessity. The core idea of modal logic is we introduce two new logical operators. These are sentential operators. So they behave structurally, grammatically, like negation. What I mean by that is you can just slap them onto the front of any sentence you have. But they don't mean what negation means. They just grammatically behave that way. What they mean, we have two. We have the diamond. The diamond is, it's possible that. And we have the box. And the box means, it's necessary that. And note, the nice thing about these shapes, I've already done it, is you can put the relevant sense inside. You can label them. Logical necessity, real possibility, metaphysical possibility, etc., 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 etc. But the diamond means it's possible. The box means it's necessary. These operators allow us to formally express modal claims. So for example, if I wanted to say possibly my sweater is gray in CFL, cool, I can just do diamond G. This is just a formal way for us to say possibly true that sentence G. Whatever G is, we don't care. In this case, it's mapped to my sweater being gray. Another one. I could say necessarily, if Nathan exists, then Nathan's human. Well, I can express this formally in FOL as box. It's necessarily the case that there is something such that if it's Nathan, then that thing is human. Again, yes, please.
Is the box a logical necessity or what?
It doesn't matter, right? So in this case, we can label it depending on whatever sense we want to use. So that's the thing. I haven't labeled them here because we can ask, like, which sense did we want to talk about? The operators themselves allow for us to specify, but of course the operators remain the same, just depending on which sense you want. Now, notably, we have two operators, but they're actually interdefinable. What I mean by that is, P is necessary if and only if it's not possible that not P. So let's think about it, right? The box means it's necessarily true. Box P means, hey, P must be true. So if P must be true, what's not possible? For P to be false. Box P, if and only if, it's not the case that possibly not P. Do we see the idea? Again, it's another way just to say something's necessarily true if it's not possibly false. Similarly, something's possibly true if and only if its negation isn't necessary. Right? So, possibly my sweater is gray because it's not the case that my sweater is necessarily not gray.
It's also not necessarily that it's gray. So you can put the second one, so without the negation in the P.
But importantly, that's only because we also think it's possibly gray. Right? So all that matters is that when we think about these operators, we can shift back and forth between them. Right? If something's necessary, then its negation is not possible. If something's possible, then its negation is not necessary. Right? Again, the general thought here is if it's possibly true, then it's not guaranteed to be false. And if it has to be true, then there ain't no way you're going to make it false. Please.
And these operators are not in TFL and not in FOL? Or?
They're not in either of them, right? But we have very natural extensions of these. Right? In fact, that's what we're going to talk about next. So, how could we build these operators into our logical systems? If we wanted to add them to TFL or to FOL to let us talk about possibilities and necessities. Because TFL doesn't let us do this, FOL doesn't let us do this. Well, one thing to note about them, and this is in the middle of the slides, it's worth mentioning, these are not truth functional. They're not like conjunction or disjunction or anything like this. We can't understand them purely in terms of kind of input truth values, output truth values. We're going to have to do something slightly heavier. So here's how we understand them. Okay? And it's going to look scary at first, but we'll talk through it. Don't worry. So our solution is going to be using possible world semantics. Okay? So here's the basic idea. The basic idea is that we're going to introduce for every sentence an index of assessment. That's just a fancy way of saying, we're going to say, hey, where are you saying this? You know this already. If someone says it's raining, it's very silly if you're talking with someone on the phone and they say it's raining, for you to look out the window and say, no, it's not. My mother does this occasionally. I'm talking to her, she's in California and I'm here. She's like, oh, it's really cold. It'd be very silly of me to say, no, it's quite warm. Not just because of the weather, but because we're in different places. It's raining here. It's raining now. It's raining over there. Right? It's dark in Australia, not here. This is going to be what we're going to do. This is the first move to help us. The truth of a claim for possible world semantics is going to be relative to a context of assessment, a world. So instead of just a sentence being true or false, it will be true or false at a particular index. It's raining here versus not in California, because it never fucking rains in California. Famous. So we'll have index of assessments. That's one thing. Here's the second really cool thing. These places, these worlds, they can see each other. And this seeing, this accessing, that's going to be how we can talk about what's possibly true. So things will be true at one index. It'll be raining here. But we know it's possibly not raining because we can access a different location. Let's say California, where it isn't raining. That's the idea. We index all these claims, and then we allow the indexes to see each other. And if you can see one where some sentence is true, that's why you can say it's possibly the case. And if everyone that you see is some way, that's why you say it's necessarily the case. So let's give you this slightly more formally. We're going to have a triple. We'll have W, which is a set of worlds. These are indices. These are points. These are locations, times. Again, we'll just call them worlds. Then we'll have R. R is an accessibility relation. It's how our various indices see each other. And then finally we have V, which is a valuation function. This is just a fancy way to say V tells us, hey, for each world, is this sentence true or false? If we look in Tilburg, is it raining or not? If we look in California, is it raining or not? The valuation function tells us what's happening in all of the different locations. So, metaphorically speaking, what we have, W gives us the multiverse. Here's all of the different ways things could be, the different worlds. R is how well they can see each other. And V tells us what's true at each given world. With this, we'll be able to define the box and the diamond. So again, the easy way to think about it, you've got a whole bunch of points. And at each point, our valuation function will tell us, okay, at this world, P is true, Q is true, and R is true. Okay? At this world, P is true and R is true, but Q is false. And finally, what our R function, our relation, is going to do is say the first world can see the second one. So here's the big thing. Here's how we understand our logical operators. Diamond P is true at a world if and only if there's some world it can see where P. Box P is true at a world if and only if at every world it can see P. So I'll give you an example. This is easier to see visually.
Does W mean where?
It means a world.
Overall, yes, sorry.
So, again, let's just give a very small mapping. So here's a very, very silly example, but it will give the idea. In this toy model, we have 3 worlds. We have world 1, world 2, and world 3. At each world, we have valuations telling us which sentences are true and false, right? So here, P and Q are true. Here, P is false and Q is true. Here, P and Q are both false. With me so far? Now, the only thing missing is how the worlds can see each other. Now, let's draw some arrows. Right? And the arrows will basically be accessibility. So we'll say that 3 can see 1, 1 can see 2, 2 can see 3. Okay. Now with this, we can start to ask what's possible and necessary at a given world. So for example, if we look at world 1, nice to also get their lecture too.
Yeah.
So at world 1, possibly not P is true. Why? Because there is a place that it can see where not P is the case. You see the idea? Similarly, if we go from world 1 Q, possibly Q is true at world 1 because it can see a world where Q is true. Let's draw one more relation. let's say that one can see itself. So with this in mind, what's another claim that's going to be true at world 1?
Possibility.
Yeah. We see the idea? Because it can see somewhere where that's the case. What's another claim that's true at world 1? We've only been doing possibility claims, but what's something else that's true?
Q. So
So it can see itself, right? But in every time, right, it's always going to be a modal claim here. Right? So it's going to have a box for diamond.
Necessity.
Yeah, right? Because every world it can see, Q is the case. Yes?
But is it possible for one to see a negation?
Ah. So as we've set this up, no. But we can, so this highlights the neat thing about this way of thinking about modal claims. We have to think about what worlds there are. We have to think about what's true in all the worlds. But probably even more important than that, we need to figure out who can see who. What's the accessibility relation like? So in this case, we have a very weird accessibility relation, and it's very just bespoke. But if, for example, we started doing this, whenever an arrow goes one way, it also goes the other. In this case, is box Q true still at world 1? Because now I can see 3. Again, got the arrows going both directions. So now I can finally see the world where not Q.
So then it stops being a necessity.
So now it doesn't have any necessity, right?
Again, the core idea here, what I really want to get to is this basic idea. Right? The way we understand possibility and necessity claims, we understand it in terms of basically this model, right? We have these worlds, they see each other, and what they see tells us what's possible and necessary. Yeah, come back in a second. Yes.
But how is it then with the previous example, when they go just one way with the logical possibility, then it's logical possible and Q is negation.
Good. So importantly, right, we were playing around with the toy model. Right? Obviously, when we start to map our alethic modalities, we're going to have to think very carefully about how we really want the accessibility relation to be. So, again, we're thinking about the initial example, which was just to kind of get us a feel for it. Then there's the like, okay, cool, now let's cash this out and make this work for me, right? Yes?
Then there can be infinite worlds.
As many worlds as we need, and these worlds are going to have a whole bunch of different combinations of what's true and false in them, and God willing, they're all going to be able to see each other.
But is it then ever possible to say that something is a necessity?
Well, so again, this is kind of important. This ties into a question we're going to talk about in the second half, right? All of this hinges. So again, this is just a way for us to understand when the diamond and box claims are true. There's another question of populate the worlds for me. How many worlds are there? What are they like? And there's a deep sense in which actually figuring that out is telling us the real space of possibilities. If it turns out that there's one weird ass world over here where R is the case, right, and not P, and not Q, this is a very strange world. So we have a challenge here about mapping our formal system, which is, again, this is just a formal system, onto the stuff we really want to get out. When we're just doing the logic of it, it's just giving us the formal system. The next step is line this up for me. So, again, the important things here, if we see a box or a diamond claim, we can understand how it works. The diamond claim means, hey, I can see a world where the undiamond sentence is the case. Diamond P is true at world 1 because 1 can see a world, namely itself, where P. Diamond not P is true in world 1 because it can see a world, namely 2, where not P. You get the idea? So, sorry. So a couple of things to note. Essential to all of this is the idea of worlds. These points of reference, indices. Along with that, there's also about the accessibility relations. The accessibility relations are equally as important, in fact, in many ways, often more. Because how we think about the nature of the accessibility relation will tell us various things. So I'm going to skip a little quick. Not going to ask you about this stuff, but it's maybe worth knowing. I'll leave it in the slides. The features we ascribed to the accessibility relation are what determine what modal logic we have. But importantly, how we populate the worlds, how many worlds we have, what we think are true and false in them, that's actually going to deliver us the various modal claims. So again, I'm going to go through this. I'll leave it in the slides for you if you're interested. I'm not going to ask you anything about it, but it's something that's useful to know if you're interested. One thing that's very cool is, again, all of this is designed to try and capture a lethic modality. Because ideally what we want is the worlds to then correspond with, well, genuine ways the world could be. But we don't have to do that. We can actually use this same system to map non-alethic modalities. So we can do deontic logic. This is about what we could do, what we must do. Oughts and cans. We can do temporal logic, where we use times as indices. And the operators in accessibility will be determined in terms of future and beforehand.
But do we need to know this because you're going first?
Just want to kind of flag it up. I promise I'll always make it very clear what's important. So, what's important for us is that possible world semantics gives us a way to formally capture modal claims in terms of these possible worlds, indices of assessment. But of course, nothing about the logic, the formal system, tells us what worlds are. All they are just elements in a model, circles on a fucking board with arrows between them with P's and Q's in them. But if we're really going to cash out the notion of, hey, it's possible that my sweater is gray, why is that? What kind of thing is the possible world where my sweater is gray? And this is where we get to the second half. Because one of the big debates here is what exactly are possible worlds? So again, we know what they do, what we can use them for. We can use them in this formal system to map and explain when possible claims or necessary claims are true or false. But the big question is, what the hell kind of thing are worlds? Okay. So let's take a break. We'll take a break to 50, right? And then we'll come back and we'll talk about what kind of things worlds might be.